Hi, my name is Julie Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us today as part of our Security Outcome Deep Dive webinar series. In the Deep Dive series, we examine in more detail each outcome in our Identity Defined Security Outcome Library, which we published recently. A member of our technical working group team who developed the outcomes will join me to discuss the goals of the outcome and the various implementation approaches. My guest today is Cassie Christensen. Cassie brings more than 14 years of identity and data management experience into her current role as a SecZetta client advisor. She focuses on third-party identity and risk and works with clients and partners to plan, build, and run third-party onboarding and risk programs. Cassie, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, great to be here.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit more about the IDSA before we dive into today's security outcome that's focused on continuous identity assurance. I want to note that if you've watched other webcasts in this series or may already be familiar with the IDSA and really just here to get to the good stuff, you might want to skip ahead about 8 minutes for the discussion on this particular security outcome. So let's get started. The IDSA exists to help organizations with the key challenges that you're facing today. It's no secret that cybersecurity has become cumulatively challenging. Threats and vulnerabilities are a moving target. New technologies and defense mechanisms are introduced daily. And now with COVID-19, our traditional work environment has been turned upside down. Most organizations have been collecting identity and security tools over many years, solving the threat of the day, week, or year. A single tool, single vendor approach is not working, as witnessed by the last challenge. The number of identities organizations manage and secure has exploded in the last 5 years, and the risks associated with those identities has as well. In our latest research, we found that 79% of organizations had suffered an identity-related breach in the last 2 years. Which leads us to the need for a new approach to security. Identity has moved beyond an operational function and should now be considered a critical cybersecurity technology. It's important to recognize that every business transaction, attack surface, or target involves a credential and a service or piece of data. We can no longer sustain a one problem, one tool approach. Cybersecurity technologies must fundamentally work together if they are to achieve meaningful effectiveness. And we must operate with the mindset that the cumulative investment must make the whole more effective. We must share the intelligence, the identity context across the entire enterprise technology stack. But wait, some of you might think identity in and of itself is really hard, right? Well, the good news is that identity technologies have come a long way in the last 5 years. They are becoming easier to deploy and maintain. The identity and access management technology segments are working better together, and integration between identity technologies has improved as well. Our goal is to help bridge what we see as the gap to security, not just the integration of identity with security technologies to improve your cumulative security spend, but to make you more secure through identity. So who are we? The Identity Defined Security Alliance is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members who provide guidance on our mission and represent you, the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, webinars, and speaking at industry conferences. The Identity-Centric Security Framework, which consists of vendor-agnostic best practices, security outcomes and approaches, which we'll talk about today, customer implementation stories, and the ultimate goal of creating a virtual community for sharing experience as well as validation of this approach to security strategies. The primary work product, as I mentioned, of our technical working group is the Identity Defined Security Framework, which consists of security outcomes, implementation approaches, and best practices. We make recommendations around best practices and security outcomes. However, we provide multiple alternatives to achieve the desired outcome through implementation approaches, and only you, and perhaps your vendors, can determine what approach is best for you. This is a full library of security outcomes that have been published to date. The goal is to expand this library as a free community resource. The technical working group team will be adding to the library, but we also want to enlist the expertise of those living and working in the trenches and implementing identity security outcomes to add to it as well. And I'll let you know how you can get involved at the end of the session today. So today we're going to dig more specifically into users' access is systematically proven throughout the identity lifetime. So as mentioned, the identity-defined security framework incorporates best practices in addition to the security outcomes. This outcome in particular is more effective with a best practice that is focused on maintaining current and accurate authoritative data for identities. So Cassie, why don't you walk us through this recommended best practice and process flow?
Yeah, absolutely. So to your earlier point around technologies needing to work together, the goal of this best practice is to ensure that the source data that our tools pull identity details from are as accurate and up-to-date and proactively maintained as possible. So if we start in the middle with an authoritative source or an authoritative record about an individual, that's really the root of any identity-centric program. And from there, we talk about how do we proactively maintain both that record as well as its resulting access, and then ultimately terminate that or deactivate that as needed. So if you start with the creation, that would be like your onboarding events. If you're talking about an employee, that would be when they were hired, or a non-employee, that would be the day that you found out the people that were coming, maybe from a contractor organization, etc. You would start there. You would probably want to ensure that the person that you were representing by this source record was who they say they are. So that would be where we'd want to proof the identity, and we're going to get into that more here in a little bit. From there, we're going to say, okay, we've proved that this person is who they say they are. We've tied the record together. We have an authoritative source. This is the access we now want to grant. From there, you're going to move through the process of certifying that access. If that certification ever fails, that would be when access would be removed, ultimately resulting in deactivation of that user. And on the other side, similarly, you want to ensure that the relationship that ultimately led to the creation of that source record, that authoritative information, that you're revalidating that relationship maintains itself as well. So if they're coming from that third-party organization, if they ever terminate their employment there, that you're proactively informed so that you can deactivate that user and ultimately remove that access as well. Make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. Awesome. So let's move on and talk about how that supports our security outcome. Talk a little bit more about this particular outcome and why is it important?
Sure. So kind of as we alluded to in the last slide, once you create this authoritative information, there's this onus of making sure that that information is actually tied to the individual that you think it represents. And there's different ways to do that, and we'll get into the approaches here in a minute, but you want to make sure that you're proactively maintaining that source record. So you're going to periodically proof that information and make sure that any changes are immediately recorded and that leads downstream into ultimately the access that would be providing.
So, Cassie, if I'm a business owner who is working with a third party, I think this outcome is very directly related to that particular scenario. So, obviously, I want to make sure that if one of the employees of my third-party partner leaves, I don't want that person to be able to carry their access on. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Absolutely. Yep. That's a perfect scenario. It could also result, though, as we're moving everybody to be more remote and you're pushing them out into remote locations, how do we ensure that as they've moved and they're on devices and in locations that we've never, proofed before, that the source information that we have is still tied to that individual? There might be additional steps that we need to do initially as people change the way that they work to ensure that the person behind the computer that's representing a set of credentials is actually who they say they are. Maybe that's a match to some kind of a form of identification, or maybe that's some kind of a physical check-in, or, you know, it can be a number of things, but lots of scenarios where this could apply.
So really, it totally could apply to any types of identities, really, and maybe we'll get into that here in a minute. But it's not just third parties, it's not just employees, but really anyone that has some sort of a relationship with an organization that might have access to sensitive corporate data or applications.
Absolutely.
Cool. So in our recent research that I referenced earlier, it was a paper that was published in May called Identity Security, a Work in Progress. We asked a question of the participants about common security frameworks that they follow and you know, utilize for their security strategies, things like NIST, cybersecurity, and maybe in some cases compliance frameworks depending on their industry. How does this particular outcome map to those commonly used security and compliance frameworks?
Sure. Specifically, you know, Zero Trust, NIST, GDPR, they all have this underlying idea that you need to, that trust is something that shouldn't just be given, right? It should be earned. And to earn that trust, you should be, you know, required to prove that you are the person that you're representing in your, you know, your cyber footprint. And so really this ties into all of those existing frameworks. This isn't anything necessarily new. It's just defining a piece of that idea of, you know, earning trust.
Cool, got it. Okay. So obviously breaches are top of mind these days. There's been a few high-profile breaches recently, and then also kind of pointing back to the research we found that some of the leading causes included phishing, stolen credentials, and inadequately managed credentials as security incidents that happened in the last couple of years more specifically. How does this outcome address those common causes of breaches? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Some of the really notable ones that we've heard about, large retailers that have, you know, complex and massive, honestly, supplier and vendor networks and relationships, all of them needing some kind of access. We've had some very notable breaches come from those third parties having, you know, terminated somebody from their side, but that person still having access into that large retailer's ecosystem, and ultimately, you know, leveraging that access to move through and cause the breach that ultimately cost them millions of dollars. So even if the account itself is fairly small and the access granted initially could be deemed as, you know, relatively, I guess, unimportant, the breach vector and the amount of money that this has caused organizations is pretty massive.
No doubt. Yeah, breaches, regardless of where they start, are reputational damage too, right? No one wants to end up in the headlines for having a breach, as we've seen recently, specifically. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the results of the survey that might tie back to this particular security outcome and give us some insight as to why this is so important. There was a question asked about confidence in effectively managing and security identities. And overall, there's a tremendous amount of confidence across all identities, although more so in privileged identities, and certainly, as you can see, less in IoT-related identities. So how do these results tie back to this survey and sort of the perspective on confidence?
Sure. So if you think about this in the way of like what organizations have the best information around and the best ability to know who their end user is, to essentially prove out who that end user is, as they move away from those people that have gone through, like an employee has gone through an I-9 type of physical verification of who they are when they were onboarded before they were granted any kind of access. Typically, those users are who ultimately, you know, through time or through position that they've gained, are able to get privileged access, you know. And as you move away from those people that are, you know, very tightly tied and coupled to the organization and ultimately have similar motivations for the success of the organization to those other parties, you'll see that the confidence in them being able to secure that group of individuals starts to decrease. So because, as you were talking about earlier, a breach always includes some kind of a phishing or compromised credential set, the ability to proof out the identity on the other end of the line for those additional groups of users can be very confidence inspiring, and assist them with, feeding that information downstream into their other tools, ultimately making their entire identity security program increase in confidence for those other populations.
Perfect. Okay, so why don't we jump forward and start talking about how organizations can achieve this particular security outcome. As I mentioned previously, we're providing multiple approaches and letting you decide which works best for your goals, situation, and requirements. With this particular outcome, there's two different approaches, the physical verification and the electronic verification. So Cassie, kind of walk us through the first that uses a physical verification to validate that identity.
Sure. So this is probably the one that we're most familiar with, that's been around the longest. This is somebody being essentially there physically for you to prove out who they are. When I was onboarded at most of the organizations that I've worked for in my life, as I was completing my I-9, I had to show up on my first day, present some form of verification, and they were able to physically hold that verification and compare me to the picture on it and know that I was, who I was representing as I was being onboarded. And only once I had passed that and what other, maybe other background check pieces of that, that was when I was onboarded. So this is really about showing up, having a person on the other side confirm that you are who you say you are, and that, you're representing the person that is being onboarded. Now, some things that
Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. Some things that I think are interesting about this is the amount of responsibility that's placed on individuals. And, where I think that, our next approach can even apply sometimes to employees, which is this is a lot of responsibility for somebody from an HR department to make sure that, somebody doesn't just look similar to an ID picture or something of that nature, if that's what they were trying to do. So there are some you have to assign responsible parties inside of an organization that are going to take on this task. And you have to have enough data, sufficient data that's being collected for them to make that comparison and to be trusted with the outcome of that comparison.
And so I think about my experience as an employee for an organization, same thing, right? You passport, some form of ID, official form of ID, but how do organizations, and I would say do organizations, because I don't think it's ever happened to me, ever come back at some future point in the time and say, I want you to validate again that you are who you say that you are, or, is there a need to go back and do that even in a physical verification type of approach?
I haven't had that happen often with myself. Now, I think where this starts to kind of blur lines between some of our initiatives is I think once you have that really high level of confidence in your authoritative information, and you've gone through, physical processes of being granted things like your equipment, that, even multi-factor authentication could maybe spill over into a form of proofing, right? It's all based on information that you know about the equipment and the person, and, there's an implied trust there where that can kind of spill in. But no, I think that this is something that we don't often do inside of organizations when somebody's onboarded. And maybe as we're moving more and more towards more remote workforce scenarios, it might be something that we see crop up, but I see it less.
Yeah, and to your point, probably not as important for employees necessarily, because you've established that trust relationship. They're an employee, they get paid, they're delivering some sort of value to you as an organization. But in a third-party scenario, if you've only done a one-time physical verification check, it may put you somewhat at risk.
Yeah, exactly. exactly. And I think that's really where approach number 2 kind of starts to come in. I know you're kind of advancing forward, but
perfect segue.
Yeah. So approach number 2 is really all about leveraging what you have online and being able to do that kind of a proofing or that validation of data from a remote position. So this can come in a few different formats, right? So it could be still comparing to some kind of a legal documentation. So a scan, like if maybe you're using your phone, right? And I know this happened to me when I was doing stuff for TSA, right? I had to scan my ID and both front and back, and they, made sure that the person in front of my ID, so when I took a selfie, that matched that kind of online physical proof is still provided, but it's all, comparatively done online and with algorithms on the back end, which is kind of nice. I think I kind of interrupted you. Did you have something you wanted to add to that too?
No, I was actually moving on to the next one to talk about the more digital approach. I think about an experience I had recently where I submitted an application for a new credit card. And the credit card company, needed to get access to my credit report, which I had frozen. And they called me and asked me a couple of pieces of verifying information, the typical one, right? The last 4 digits of your social security number. But then they also asked, as a second form of authentication to prove that I was who I said I was, that they wanted to send a code to my phone and then have me tell them what that code is. Seems very secure, right? Okay. However, it broke down when they said, can you tell me the phone number that I should send the code to?
Right. But another way that you can maybe pull that is, so some of these, like Experian and TransUnion, those, the cell companies actually report to those. So if you're using one of these vendors out there that have the ability to pull from those credit bureau type organizations, they can actually pull information about the cell phone companies themselves and relate that to a cell phone number that they think you held. So maybe they send it to that cell number, and only if you weren't able to verify, then maybe you'd have to step up to another way to proof. But that kind of information is great. And, the fact that it's maintained by organizations that hopefully we have a little bit of trust in, obviously wavering a bit considering recent events, but, that's another great way to kind of do that online proofing as well.
Yeah. So anything else you want to add on this last implementation approach before we start to wrap up?
The other piece that I think is interesting around the ability to do online data verification or identity verification is that you can revalidate here. So in our scenario earlier, we were talking about that third-party person being at an organization and then them leaving, and ultimately that even, resulting in breaches. What if we were proactively using a system to reach out to either their home domain email address and making sure that they could click through, thus ensuring that they still had that relationship there and should still, potentially be working with our organization as the supplier or whatever. I think that's a great one. And then I also think, as kind of part to that, if you leverage a delegate on their side. So perhaps they've done that physical verification and proofing already. They did the I-9 process to onboard that employee. And so we send a quick note out to their party and say, hey, does Bob still work for you? Should he still be engaged with us? Is that still the role he's in, et cetera? Those types of revalidations can also be kind of key in that earlier best practice we were talking about of keeping that information up to date.
Right. Yeah, that seems like a really important step and a great best practice. Okay, perfect. I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about how do you become a forward thinking. So if we go back to the adoption statistics, one of the things our research found is that those organizations that did focus on identity-centric security strategies were significantly less likely to have a breach than those that were more reactive. So of course, what's on everybody's mind is how do I get there? And these are 5 steps that we put together. Obviously you want to start with discovering all of your identity types and make sure to include human employees, customers, third parties, as we talked about today, and non-human, so applications, services, and IoT. Identify the vulnerability and risk associated with each identity type. With the shift to remote workforce that's on everybody's mind, this may have changed. And you also want to focus on your corporate resources too. Next, establish your current state against the identity security outcomes that we recommend, and you can find those on our website. Create a roadmap and work with your solution provider and vendors to determine capabilities and identify the gaps. And then lastly, implement using the desired approach and certainly measure success. That is the key to it all. So with that, I want to thank Cassie. Thanks so much for being here today and all your contributions to the Identity Defined Security Alliance through the technical working groups.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And lastly, before we sign off, I wanted to point you to some additional resources that support the discussion that we had today. The research report, I mentioned identity security work in progress, you can find on our website, as well as attached to the BrightTalk registration page. And there's also several blogs on our website that you might be interested in as well. This deep dive series will continue. Each session will be posted to our BrightTalk channel as they're recorded, so make sure you stay in touch with what we're doing there. And certainly another way to stay current is to follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest blogs and content that we've been publishing, as well as updates around our technical working groups. So thanks again for joining us today. The slides from the webinar will be posted out on our community forum, and we hope that you will join us in our mission of bringing identity and security closer together. Thanks and have a great day.